No one ever tells you this, but I will. Hidden inside the faded pages of old Betty Crocker cookbooks are suppers that once defined American family tables, but today, they've almost vanished. These weren't fancy restaurant dishes, they were comforting, creative meals that stretched $1 and fed hungry families after long days. From hearty meatloaves with a secret surprise to quirky casseroles that only the 1950s could dream up, each dish carries a story of thrift, tradition, and togetherness. Tonight, we're bringing back 10 old Betty Crocker suppers nobody cooks anymore. No one ever tells you this, but I will. Hidden inside the faded pages of old Betty Crocker cookbooks are suppers that once defined American family tables, but today, they've almost vanished. These weren't fancy restaurant dishes, they were comforting, creative meals that stretched $1 and fed hungry families after long days. From hearty meatloaves with a secret surprise to quirky casseroles that only the 1950s could dream up, each dish carries a story of thrift, tradition, and togetherness. Tonight, we're bringing back 10 old Betty Crocker suppers nobody cooks anymore. Macaroni and cheese with hot dogs. No one ever tells you this, but I will. There was once a supper so simple, so unpretentious, that it became a childhood memory etched into the hearts of millions: macaroni and cheese with hot dogs. It wasn't about fine dining. It was about joy, comfort, and a little splash of fun on an ordinary evening. Macaroni and cheese itself had been around for generations, a beloved dish of baked noodles and creamy sauce. But after World War II, when processed foods became a symbol of modern convenience, the boxed version of mac and cheese took over American kitchens. It was cheap, quick, and foolproof. And somewhere along the way, mothers, and sometimes tired fathers, started slicing in hot dogs to make it feel more like a complete meal. This wasn't about culinary tradition. It was about feeding a family when time and money were tight, while still giving the kids something they'd eat without complaint. The salty, smoky bite of hot dog against the gooey, cheesy pasta turned into a kind of magic. To a child in the 1950s, this was excitement on a plate, fast food without leaving home. For parents, it meant stretching a box of macaroni just a little further. For kids, it meant the thrill of mixing two favorites into one dish. Families remember it as a Friday night treat, or the kind of dinner grandma would whip up when she wanted to see smiles at the table. But somewhere along the way, as tastes changed and health trends took over, macaroni and cheese with hot dogs faded into memory. Today, it sits mostly in the realm of nostalgia, remembered in quiet kitchen stories rather than celebrated on supper tables. Yet, in its simplicity, it represents an era when family suppers didn't need to be complicated, they just needed to be shared. Maybe that's why, even now, one bite can take you back to a time when dinner was simple, warm, and wonderfully familiar. Creamed chicken on biscuits. No one ever tells you this, but I will. There was a time when creamed chicken on biscuits was more than just supper, it was comfort you could hold in your hands. This dish, rich yet humble, carried the taste of home during an era when food wasn't just about flavor, but about reassurance. Creamed chicken had its roots in frugality. Families in the early 20th century often stretched leftover roasted chicken by dicing it finely and folding it into a silky white sauce made from butter, milk, and flour. What could have been a meager amount of meat suddenly became enough to feed everyone, especially when ladled over warm, flaky biscuits. By the 1940s and 50s, it had become a staple in cookbooks, especially those by Betty Crocker, because it represented the perfect balance of thrift and indulgence. The meal was hearty without being heavy. A plate of golden biscuits, fresh from the oven, smothered in creamy chicken gravy, it was the kind of dish that warmed you after church on Sundays or soothed tired parents at the end of a long workday. Children remember pulling apart those biscuits, letting the creamy sauce soak in, and savoring the taste that felt like a hug from the kitchen. But more than its taste, creamed chicken on biscuits carried a kind of emotional weight. It was often served during hard times, when a family needed both nourishment and comfort. In many ways, it was survival food dressed up to feel special, proof that even in lean years, love could be served on a plate. Today, it's a dish that has nearly vanished, overshadowed by fast food and modern shortcuts. But for those who remember, the memory of that creamy sauce spilling over buttery biscuits is like stepping back into a kitchen filled with warmth, laughter, and the simple joy of a meal made with care. Maybe it's time to bring this forgotten supper back to the table. Spanish rice bake. No one ever tells you this, but I will. Before international flavors became mainstream, there was one dish that gave mid-century American families a taste of something exotic: Spanish rice bake. It wasn't authentically Spanish, and it certainly wasn't Mexican, but in the pages of Betty Crocker cookbooks, it felt adventurous, colorful, and just different enough to be exciting. At its core, Spanish rice bake was a thrifty casserole built on staples every home already had: rice, canned tomatoes, ground beef, and a sprinkle of chili powder or paprika. Mixed together, baked until bubbling, and topped with melted cheese, it became a hearty one-pan meal that was as filling as it was cheerful. In the 1950s and 60s, when convenience was king, this dish was a weeknight lifesaver. Moms could prep it quickly, pop it in the oven, and have dinner ready without fuss. That Spanish label reflected a mid-century fascination with giving ordinary dishes a worldly twist. For families who had never traveled far from home, serving Spanish rice bake felt adventurous, almost like bringing a piece of the world into their dining room. The bright colors of tomato and pepper stood out against the rice, making it as pleasing to the eye as it was to the stomach. Kids loved it because it was cheesy and comforting. Parents loved it because it stretched ingredients further and kept everyone full. And while it might not have been authentic, it was a genuine reflection of American creativity in the kitchen, taking inspiration from afar, then shaping it into something practical and family-friendly. Today, Spanish rice bake is almost forgotten, pushed aside by more authentic recipes and modern tastes. But for those who grew up in the glow of casserole dishes and oven-baked suppers, just the thought of that bubbling pan brings back the smell of tomatoes, the warmth of melted cheese, and the simple joy of gathering around the table. Maybe it's time to let Spanish rice. Swiss steak. Picture this: a sturdy cast-iron skillet, the smell of onions caramelizing low and slow, and a tough cut of beef transforming into something tender enough to fall apart with a fork. That was Swiss steak, one of those dishes that turned ordinary weeknights into something memorable. Despite its name, Swiss steak wasn't Swiss at all. The word Swiss referred to the technique of tenderizing the meat, usually by pounding or rolling it before cooking. In the lean years of the 1940s and 50s, this mattered. Families couldn't always afford expensive cuts, but with a little patience and creativity, a cheaper piece of beef could be made into a flavorful, hearty meal. The process was simple but magical. A round steak or chuck was dredged in flour, browned, and then simmered slowly in a sauce of tomatoes, onions, and sometimes green peppers. The long cooking time allowed the flavors to mingle, turning the meat into something rich, savory, and comforting. Served with mashed potatoes or buttered noodles, it was the kind of supper that filled the stomach and warmed the spirit. What people remember most about Swiss steak wasn't just the taste, it was the ritual. The smell drifting from the kitchen all afternoon, the clatter of plates set out on the dining table, and the anticipation of that first bite when the meat practically melted. It was a dish that spoke of patience, of homemaking, of the quiet love that went into stretching every ingredient into a meal worth remembering. Over time, as convenience foods took over, Swiss steak began to fade. The slow simmer didn't fit into busier lifestyles, and what was once a common dish slipped quietly into the past. But for those who grew up with it, Swiss steak is more than just food, it's a memory of family, warmth, and the gentle art of making something extraordinary from something humble. Maybe it deserves a place on the table once again. Turkey fricassee. Long before leftovers were seen as boring, there was a dish that gave them new life: turkey fricassee. For many mid-century families, this was the answer to what do we do with the rest of the bird after a big Sunday roast or Thanksgiving feast. The roots of fricassee go back centuries, with European kitchens using the method to simmer poultry in a rich, creamy sauce. In America, Betty Crocker and countless home cooks adapted the tradition, turning turkey scraps into a supper that felt elegant, even if it was made from yesterday's meal. The process was practical but special. Leftover turkey was chopped into bite-sized pieces, then simmered slowly in a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. Sometimes mushrooms, onions, or peas were added for color and substance. The result was spooned generously over rice, mashed potatoes, or more often, fluffy baking powder biscuits. What had once been scraps became a dish worthy of gathering the family around the table once again. This was more than just thrift, it was a ritual of care. Mothers and grandmothers knew how to stretch a single turkey into 2 or 3 meals, making sure nothing went to waste. But they also knew how to turn those efforts into something comforting and delicious. The creamy sauce, the tender meat, the smell of biscuits baking alongside, it all carried the feeling of being looked after, of home itself. For many children of the 1940s and 50s, turkey fricassee was the taste of the day after Thanksgiving, when the excitement of the holiday lingered in the kitchen. It wasn't just about using leftovers, it was about extending the warmth of family celebration just a little bit longer. Today, the dish is rarely seen, tucked away in vintage cookbooks. But one bite of creamy turkey fricassee could bring back the memory of crowded kitchens, clinking plates, and the quiet love of meals that made nothing feel wasted. Shepherd's pie. Imagine walking into a kitchen on a cold evening, the oven humming, and the smell of something rich and savory filling the air. On the table, a bubbling casserole topped with golden mashed potatoes, it could only be shepherd's pie. For many American families of the mid-20th century, this dish was the definition of cozy comfort. Though its roots are firmly British and Irish, shepherd's pie found a home in American kitchens during the 1940s and 50s, especially when thrift and creativity were necessary. Traditionally made with lamb, it was often adapted with ground beef, since that was cheaper and easier to find in the States. Betty Crocker's cookbooks featured versions that encouraged housewives to use leftovers, stretching every bite into a hearty new meal. The genius of shepherd's pie was in its layers. Ground meat simmered with onions, sometimes carrots and peas, then smoothed over with a thick blanket of mashed potatoes. As it baked, the top crisped just enough, creating that irresistible contrast of creamy and crunchy in each spoonful. It wasn't fancy, it was practical, but it carried a warmth that made it feel like something more. Families remember this dish not just for the taste but for the way it brought everyone together. Children scooping deep to get both potato and meat in one bite, parents glad to see clean plates after a long day. It was the kind of meal that didn't just fill stomachs, it filled the home with comfort. Over time, as food trends shifted, shepherd's pie slipped quietly into the background, remembered mostly by those who grew up in kitchens where nothing was wasted. Yet its spirit remains, a dish built on practicality, transformed into comfort, and always tied to family tradition. Maybe the best way to honor that past is to bring shepherd's pie back, one golden-topped casserole at a time. Shrimp Wiggle. With a name like Shrimp Wiggle, you'd expect something playful, and that's exactly what it was. This mid-century supper wasn't about sophistication, it was about fun, thrift, and just a touch of novelty that made ordinary evenings feel a little brighter. The recipe first appeared in early 20th century cookbooks and gained traction in the 1940s and 50s, when canned shrimp became widely available in American markets. Housewives looking for quick, economical meals turned to Betty Crocker and other guides that featured shrimp wiggle as a clever pantry supper. It was the kind of dish that made seafood accessible to families who lived nowhere near the coast. The wiggle came from its presentation: small pink shrimp folded into a creamy white sauce, dotted with peas, then served over toast points, saltine crackers, or sometimes rice. The sauce had just enough richness to feel indulgent, while the peas and shrimp added pops of color and texture. It jiggled slightly on the plate, earning its cheerful name, and kids often remembered it for that little bit of whimsy. But behind its playful appearance, shrimp wiggle told a story of practicality. It stretched one can of shrimp far enough to feed a family, making seafood a once rare luxury suddenly affordable. For parents, it was a way to put something special on the table without breaking the budget. For children, it was a dish they wouldn't forget, partly because of the taste, partly because of the unforgettable name. As taste shifted, canned seafood lost its shine, and shrimp wiggle slowly disappeared from dinner tables. Today, it's mostly a curious footnote in old cookbooks, remembered by those who grew up in homes where frugality met creativity. Yet the memory of shrimp wiggle lingers, a reminder that sometimes, food isn't just nourishment. It's playfulness, resourcefulness, and a reflection of the times. One bite could still bring back that childlike smile at a supper that dared to wiggle. Meatloaf with hard-boiled egg center. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary meatloaf, humble, familiar, the kind of dish every family knew. But slice into it, and there it was, a perfect hard-boiled egg, hiding in the center like a secret treasure. This was meatloaf with hard-boiled egg center, a supper that turned a simple meal into something just a little magical. Meatloaf had long been a staple of American kitchens, especially during the Depression and wartime years, when stretching ground beef with breadcrumbs, oats, or vegetables kept it affordable. But by the 1950s, Betty Crocker and other cookbooks encouraged housewives to dress it up, to make the old classic feel new again. And that's where the egg came in, a clever trick that added protein, surprise, and even a bit of elegance to a working-class dish. The preparation was straightforward, a mixture of seasoned beef shaped into a loaf, with peeled, boiled eggs tucked carefully inside before baking. When served, each slice revealed its hidden prize, white and golden yellow against the rich brown of the meat. For children, it was a delight. For parents, it was a way to make something ordinary feel like an occasion. This dish carried more than flavor, it carried symbolism. The egg represented abundance, the idea that a modest meal could still hold a special surprise. It often appeared at Sunday suppers, potlucks, and family gatherings, where food wasn't just about feeding the body but also creating small moments of joy. Over time, as taste shifted and convenience foods took over, meatloaf with hard-boiled egg center faded into obscurity. Yet for those who remember, the memory is vivid, the knife cutting cleanly through the loaf, the egg revealed like a hidden gem, and the smiles that followed. It wasn't just supper, it was proof that even the simplest meals could hold a little wonder. We've just taken a walk through 10 suppers that once filled American kitchens with comfort, thrift, and a little creativity. From simple skillet meals to hearty casseroles, these dishes weren't about flash or fame, they were about family, resourcefulness, and the warmth of gathering around the table. Each recipe may have slipped quietly into the past, but the memories they hold still live on in the hearts of those who shared them. If this trip down memory lane stirred something in you, maybe a forgotten flavor, or the echo of voices at a family table, then stick with us. There are so many more hidden recipes and kitchen stories waiting to be uncovered. Don't forget to subscribe, because you won't want to miss the next forgotten classic we bring back to life.